Hey guys, Nick Smith here, and today I'm going to give you a quick rundown on how I process my RAW files inside of Lightroom. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and check my exposure before anything else because you want to get a good idea of where you want your levels to be at before you start making any other adjustments. And I think it looks good a little bit raised up. I did shoot this a little underexposed intentionally because I was really kind of trying to push the dynamic range of the Sony sensor and play around with this because I know a lot of my favorite photographers tend to underexpose and then bring things back. So I wanted to kind of try that out a bit with this shoot. And I've been pretty happy with the results, but we're going to raise the exposure just a little bit here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get our white balance set up. So the way I like to set my white balance is a little different than a lot of people. The first thing I do is I grab this temp slider and then I slam it all the way to the left and right, and I just make it really blue and really yellow. And what this does is it kind of resets your eyes, and then I come in between and I try to find a medium of where I think it looks good. And it makes it so you can kind of pick up on the colors a little more. And I think right about there looks decent. And if you look, I'm only 57 degrees less in color temperature. It just kind of makes it a little cooler. So when I'm moving around these sliders setting my white balance, what I'm really trying to do is pay attention to skin tone more than anything because I want to get a nice color to the skin before I do any artistic toning. So we're going to just bounce this back and forth as we did with the temp slider and all the way to green, all the way to magenta, and then come back in the middle here. And then very slowly just move it around and try to find a balance. Some point where we think it looks nice. I think about 7 looks really good. So if we go ahead and toggle this, we can see what we've done so far. And I'm just hitting the backslash key to check these adjustments kind of on the fly here. So now that we have this done, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start playing with our highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And what these sliders do is they control different areas of the image. So if we do the highlights up, we kind of start to see all the little areas that were brighter start to pop a bit more. And then if we raise our shadows, we can bring in a little more detail in the areas that might have been somewhat darker. You can see it starts to lift the shadow under her neck, a little bit of the shadows under her eyes, and some of the dark areas in the background. So now same with the whites. If we move this up, it depends on if you want to go for a flatter look, you can actually achieve that by dropping this down. Or if you're like me and you want a little more contrast to your image, you can kind of pop it up a bit. And I don't want to go too far because if you go too much, it starts to look a little too contrasty, but +3 is not too bad. I think that looked good. And then with black, what black kind of tends to do, in my opinion, is it controls your contrast the most. If you go up, it's going to be really deep contrast. If you go down, it's going to be really contrasty. So even if you raise your shadows up more, so say I want to bring back some more detail like that, if you drop your black, you can bring back in that contrast even with the lifted shadows. So I'm going to actually go ahead and do that because I kind of like the way that looks. It might be a little too lifted for me. I think it's almost too much detail I brought back there. So I'm going to put it more about 40. And then I'm going to drop the black level just a little to something like that. So if we quick toggle our before and after from the beginning with backslash one more time, we could see that's kind of where we've taken it from where it was to where it is now. And like I said, I did intentionally underexpose this because I wanted to kind of test out the dynamic range. And as you can see, it holds up really well. And let's go ahead and zoom in. And the shadows are extremely clean. There's like no noise present at all. It's amazing, the difference between this sensor and other ones. So if we just want to look at our adjustments that we made here in highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, what we can actually do is just go back down here to where our tint was, and then we can just click back and forth, which someone in the comments when I did my first video was like, you can use backslash. And I was like, yes, I know, but I like to do this because it makes it so you can kind of bounce back and forth and select. So if we just look at our difference here, it's quite a lot that we did with these little sliders. It's a very large amount of what kind of gets you your overall mood and tone. So next up is tone curve, and this is really kind of a tricky one to use because it can either be really good if you know what you're doing, or you can really mess up a photo if you don't. So the one thing I like to do sometimes is I will go ahead and place a point right about there. And I'll place another point here because when you actually bend one of these, what happens is it bends the opposite direction at that top one. So now we're going to grab this down here and we're just going to lift this up, and that's going to lift the blacks And as you'll see, it starts to fade and lose detail there. And then we're going to go ahead and drop this down. And that kind of gives it a little more of a vintagey kind of film look. And I'm going to undo with Control Z real quick because I accidentally placed another point, which I did not mean to do. So now what we can do is we can toggle this a different way. Instead of having to go back like this and then raise it up to toggle, the way you can do this now that we're on the tone curve is there's a little switch here, and you can actually just switch these on and off to check your toggle. And it's really up to you if you want to keep that kind of tone. I think it looks all right for this. It kind of gives it a moody kind of film look. I think I like it, but I might want to reduce the strength just a little bit, just because I tend to like a little more contrast to my usual images, and I've been doing a little too much with the film look lately. So I'm going to drop that down just a little bit more, just to give it back some of that contrast. So let's go ahead and toggle. And I do like the way that looks, so I'm gonna keep it for this one. And now the opposite that we can do for this is instead of lifting the blacks, we can kind of crush the highlights instead. So let's go ahead and grab that and put a neutral point. You don't want too much of a bend to it. And then you can grab your highlight. If you can manage to get the actual thing to show, you can grab a highlight. If you can, there's a certain area you have to get to there. See when that arrow pops up like that? That's when you're on the corner piece, which is the same one we did with the other one. But it's like for some reason highlights are harder to grab, and I have no idea why. But I'm having the damnedest time with this. So I'm going to actually use my mouse and turn my sensitivity on it way the hell down just so I can grab this better. There. And now you can actually go ahead and kind of bend that down. And what happens is, because we don't have another point here, it's going to start bending the entire curve. So we need to add another little point. See, this is where the curves get tricky. But what you can do is you can grab this highlight and start to bend it down to actually reduce the appearance of the highlights and how bright they are. If you pay attention to that one in the upper left-hand corner, right over here, you can notice when I start to bend this one down that it starts to fade out a lot. And any of the other bright areas, like if you look in the lights in the background, you can see them start to drop out and they get a little more faded and stuff like that. So it kind of crushes those down. But I'm not a huge fan of putting my highlights down, so I'm going to actually go ahead and just undo that. And let's go ahead and go back to this point in history, because that's when I made that little bit of extra adjustment there. And I do want to keep that because I do like this, but we don't need to keep the rest. So let's go ahead and move on to HSL. And HSL is a lot of fun. What you can do is you can change each color kind of independently of each other. So if we grab this red slider and hue, and they kind of all have these different effects. So if we grab the reds and hue, you'll see we can change quite a bit. If I move this all the way to the left, her shirt becomes a lot more red, as do the traffic lights and some other stuff in the background. If I move it all the way to the right, they become more yellow, and some stuff in the back becomes a little more red as well. So we can kind of just play with this a little bit and see where we want to put it. And I think I want to put it down just a little, like 10, just because I feel like it puts a little more red into the clothing, and I think that looks kind of nice. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to go ahead and play with the orange now. And let's pull that a little over, because if we look at her skin color, if we pull it over to the right, it starts to get a little more of a orange color to it. And I think it looks kind of nice. So let's go ahead and do something like 2. I think 2 looks good. It added just a little bit. So now the next thing you can do is yellows. And same thing. If you go all the way from left to right, you can kind of see what it's going to do to your image. And a lot of what I do in my toning is experimental, and it's just like, let's see what this will do. So if I go all the way to the left, it's going to be more red in the yellows. If I go all the way to the right, it's going to be more like a green yellow. And I think I like it raised up a little bit. So we'll try something about like 30. It makes that color a little more neutral. It was kind of bluish. It kind of makes it flatten out a bit more and blend more with the background and her outfit and skin color. So next thing we're going to do is go ahead and play with the green. And there's not a lot of green in this image, so it has like no effect as far as I can see. So let's go ahead and just put that back to 0. Same with aqua. We're getting not much. If you look, it is affecting this blue up here just a little bit. If we move this around, I think I like it with a little more aqua, so let's put that to the left. I think the color up there is a little more pleasant. We might actually just remove that later, which I think we're gonna do. But for now, I like that color better than the color it was. And then if we do blue, you can see it changes it a lot more. But let's just leave blue at 0. Like I said, I'm gonna take care of that later. If you want to reset anything, like if you don't want to like work on dialing it back, what you can also do is just double tap on the name of it, so like blue, and it'll reset it to 0 automatically for you. So now let's do purples, and nothing happening. We can reset it. Magentas, nothing happening. So if we look at what we've done so far with HSL, we can toggle that on and off. And really, it doesn't look like too much. We just kind of made the skin a little more yellow, and we went ahead and made that a little better of a blue color. But that's just in the hue. In other images, you'll notice a lot more of an effect with these sliders than this one. However, this image, it did do a little bit of work, especially in the colors of lights and stuff like that, but not a ton. Here's where we're going to make more of a difference. And this is going to be in your saturation. And what this does is it actually controls how much of a color is in your image. So if we want to put a little more red, like I said, I liked having her shirt stand out a bit. So let's do like, I wanted more like +7. I think 9's a little heavy. It kind of makes it stand out more in her shirt. And it also makes her lips come out just a little bit more. Now, I'm feeling like she's getting too saturated. There's too much orange in not only her hair, but in her face. So we're going to take the saturation and bring that down a little bit. And we'll do -10. And that just kind of makes it so her skin's a little less powerful. Same with yellow. I'm thinking maybe we could take a little yellow out as well. And that would kind of help her skin look a little less overly saturated. And now, remember when I said we're going to take that blue out, probably just to make it a little more cohesive. If you look, there's not a lot of blue in this image. In general, what we can do is we can take this aqua here and slide this down to somewhere about like 80. And we don't want to get rid of it completely because it will have an adverse effect. The model has blue eyes. So if we get rid of it completely, we'll lose the blue in her eyes. So we just want to go ahead and just kind of remove it a little bit, but we want to keep it there. Let's go ahead and continue on. There's no purple, no magenta. We figured that out earlier with these sliders, that they didn't really have an effect on this image. And now we're moving on to luminance. And luminance is really cool because it works kind of like earlier when we did the highlights and shadows portion of this. But the cool thing about it is now you can control how bright and how dark each color actually is and how it's represented. So if we wanted to keep the whole like vibrant reds that we've been going for, we can lower the luminance just a little bit to make them a little more dark, and that'll make the colors more rich. So we'll get a little more darkness in the red of the lights and in the jacket. So now what we're going to do is we're going to brighten up the orange because that will brighten up skin tones. Skin tones are typically in your orange sliders, so that's just going to kind of make this skin pop a little bit. We've already decreased the saturation a little, which I think I might want to actually decrease it some more just because I'm finding it starting to get a little too yellow. This side's a little more saturated than the other, so I want to balance it just a little better. But I do want to make this pop a little, so let's go ahead and raise this up a little bit more even, maybe more like 25. It's 26, but whatever, good enough. And now let's go ahead and move yellow around, see if we want to darken or brighten yellow at all. And I think I kind of would just leave it where it is. And then if we wanted to adjust that blue that we had up here, we could do that, but it's basically blended in with the white and gray of the background. So it's starting to look really nice. Now what we can do is we can actually add in split toning. And split toning is really nice if you only use Lightroom. It's a great way to color tone. If you use Photoshop, I would rather save my split toning and my color toning for later, but I did want to cover this just because it is something I do use every now and then before I put it into Photoshop. But let's really fast, before we do anything, let's go ahead and toggle our HSL adjustments on their own, and we'll see that this made a lot bigger of a difference than the last time we toggled this. It's quite dramatic, actually. It gives us a much more kind of desaturated urban look, which is actually really quite a popular kind of look right now. So I'm gonna actually just undo all that because I don't like to have my adjustments too much. They're down here, but it's getting messy. But I typically don't toggle too much. That's another reason I don't like the toggles, is it keeps showing like that. But let's do an overall now of before and after from where we started to where we are now with backslash. And you'll see it's quite a huge difference. So that's where we started, and that's where we are now. And the more I do that, the more I'm starting to think I might have went too bright on the skin. So I'm going to drop this luminance down to like 10, just because I think I may have went a little too far with it. But overall, I think it's looking pretty good right now. So now if we go down into split toning here, what this does is it allows us to put a color in the highlights and a color in the shadows. If you've watched any of my stuff, you know I'm a big fan of yellow highlights and blue shadows. So let's go ahead and put yellow in, and we're going to start off really strong here, and I'm going to show you why in a second. And let's go ahead and grab a blue for the shadows. And once again, we're going to start off extremely strong, and the reason why is we want to find our balance. And by having it as strong and saturated as it can, as you'll see both are at 100, what this allows us to do is to see it better. So if we move this to the left, you'll see where the blue starts to apply, and then if we move to the right, you'll see it apply more yellow. And what we want to do is we want to kind of figure out in between where we like a balance here. And I want to go right about there to where we're getting a little bit of yellow starting to come in here, which mixed with the blue makes a little bit of a green color. And then we have the yellow on all the highlights and some blue in just the really dark shadows. So now that we have that figured out, we can actually drop our saturation on both of these and then just kind of move it around until we're happy and starting to get a little more of the look we want. And I do want a little more yellow in this. So we'll do about 15 and 10. So if I toggle this on and off now, you'll see we got that just kind of little bit of a yellow tone and a little bit of blue in the shadows. And I think I might want to actually move my shadows up just a little more. I think it's starting to, I think the yellow overpowers it too much and it makes it look a little more faded and vintagey, not so much of a combative tone, which is, I like that kind of thing where the tones fight with each other because they're on opposite spectrums, and it's very like pleasing to the eye to look at that. So if we toggle this on and off, you'll see it's quite a big difference. It definitely adds a little more dimension to an image and a little more drama. And I think I might actually lower the yellow. I feel like it's getting too overpowering. So I think right about there, I actually really like it. That looks really good. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and undo all this toggling and remember my spot, which is 16 on blue and 11 on my highlights. So I'm going to quick redo those just because I want to keep this somewhat clean on the left-hand side. You don't have to do that. That's just more of a me being OCD thing. Now, detail, I typically leave this alone. I don't like to add sharpening. The only time I'll ever do this is if I need to take noise out of the shadows. I will use a little bit of noise reduction. I have a tutorial on recovering underexposed images that are like dramatically underexposed, and I do cover noise reduction in that. I'll put a card for that in the upper right-hand corner if you want to check that out to see how I would use this. But for the most part, on a general edit, I will not use this panel ever. Next is going to be lens corrections, and this I will use on some lenses, other lenses I won't. This was shot with the Sigma 85mm art, which I tend not to use my lens corrections on because I actually really like the way the vignette looks. One way you can do it is just use it, turn the vignette all the way down, and keep your distortion at 100. This lens has hardly any distortion as it is, but if I were to correct the vignette, you'll see it kind of just makes it overall brighter. I really like the look of this lens's vignette. I find it very pleasing. It's very center focused, and it kind of just makes everything darker around the edges, which gives it a little bit of a brighter pop to the subject. So I tend to not even bother with this, but if you have a lens with really bad distortion, this is a great place to fix that. Just turn it on, find your lens profile, everything like that, and then turn your distortion on. And if you find you like your vignette, you can be like me and just turn it all the way to 0. If you don't, you can actually correct it, or you can go in between and correct it just a little bit so it's not as dramatically vignetted. But typically, for my lens, I don't like to do it too much. Transform is another one. I don't tend to use this too much. This is more of a it can change things, like if you need vertical, like if something's standing too much or whatever. But I typically will not touch this for a portrait thing. It's mostly like landscapes and stuff like that. So don't even bother with this if you're worried about doing portraiture like I do. Next is your post-crop vignette. I don't like to use this too much, so I will just skip over it. Grain. I will add grain, and because this is kind of a filmy look, if we toggle this, I kind of brightened it up and gave it a film look. You know, I lifted the blacks and everything like that. I'm going to put more grain on this. So let's go ahead and grab this slider here, and let's put it up to something like 30. And if we zoom in, you'll see that it starts to put in this kind of like faux film grain look to the back, and I think we could actually kind of go up even higher. Something more like 40 would start to really get that kind of grainy look to it. And if we look at it at 100%, you'll see it starts to really kind of just add some more texture to the image, and it looks really kind of vintage and old school that way. And I think that looks really nice with that grain added to it, so I'm going to keep that adjustment. And the last thing we could do is our camera calibration, but the thing about this is if I'm going to use this, I like to do this first before I play with my HSL, because it can affect what each one of those colors is represented as. And I will probably do a separate tutorial on camera calibration, so for now we're just going to ignore that. But for the most part, we've used all the stuff we're going to use as is, and that was, we used the grain under effects, we used our split toning, we used the HSL panel, we did a bit with a tone curve, and then we adjusted our highlights, shadows, whites, black, our exposure, and our temperature. And now, the thing that I like to do last is I will add a bit of clarity, and usually I put like 5 to 10. If you go more than 10, it can start to get a little too crunchy and bad looking on the skin. So I'm going to pick about 7. And what that does is it just gives it a little bit of pop. If we toggle this back and forth, you'll see it just makes the highlights pop out and the shadows get just a little bit deeper. So we're going to do one last before and after with our backslash key here. So this is our before and this is our after, and that is basically the way I would run through and edit in Lightroom. I did a thing on how to like retouch and stuff like that as well inside of Lightroom, which I'll put a tutorial for that up in the right hand corner now, and you can go check that out if you haven't already. But for the most part, this is how I would do it before sending it off into Photoshop, minus the color tone I did, because the split toning was more of a, I want to show how to do this because I know a lot of people don't always use Photoshop to actually retouch and then do their toning. But as I said, this is basically how I would prep a file before I send it off to Photoshop to retouch it in a more advanced way. So, yeah. So hopefully you guys were able to learn something today. If you were, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you're not already. Feel free to share this on any social media you see fit. As long as my work is being shared and people are learning, I'm happy. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.